In the first service, I mentioned that I thought that was the first time we'd had a banjo in worship, but I was corrected that we used to actually have a jug band here in the church. So it's the first time in recent memory. Our reading this morning is an excerpt from Nelson Mandela's inaugural address when he was inaugurated as President of South Africa on May 10th, 1994. The time for the healing of the wounds has come. The moment to bridge the chasms that divide us has come. The time to build is upon us. We have at last achieved our political emancipation. We pledge ourselves to liberate all our people from the continuing bondage of poverty, deprivation, suffering, gender, and other discrimination. We succeeded to take our last steps to freedom in conditions of relative peace. We commit ourselves to the construction of a complete, just, and lasting peace. We have triumphed in the effort to implant hope in the breasts of the millions of our people. We enter into a covenant that we shall build the society in which all South Africans, both black and white, will be able to walk tall without any fear in their hearts, assured of their inalienable right to human dignity, a rainbow nation at peace with itself and the world. We dedicate this day to all the heroes and heroines in this country and the rest of the world who sacrificed in many ways and surrendered their lives so that we could be free. Their dreams have become a reality. Freedom is their reward. We are both humbled and elevated by the honor and privilege that you, the people of South Africa, have bestowed on us as the first president of a united, democratic, non-racial, and non-sexist South Africa, to lead our country out of the valley of darkness. We understand it's still that there is no easy road to freedom. We know it well that none of us acting alone can achieve success. We must therefore act together as a united people for national reconciliation, for nation building, for the birth of a new world. Let there be justice for all. Let there be peace for all. Let there be work, bread, water, and salt for all. Let each know that for each, the body, the mind, and the soul have been freed to fulfill themselves. Never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another and suffer the indignity of being the skunk of the world. Let freedom reign. The sun shall never set on so glorious a human achievement. God bless South Africa. The words of Nelson Mandela. So I don't know if you've heard about it, but there's a new alarm clock that's out on the market. Now, like any other alarm clock, it's a small box that sits on your nightstand, and you set it to wake you up in the morning. No problem there. But instead of showing you the time when it wakes you up, it shows you 3 different numbers. The first number is the amount of money you have in your savings account. It's a web-enabled device that actually monitors your bank accounts, and it tells you how much money you have in the bank. The second number, it being a web-enabled device, tells you how many friends you have. It picks up, from all your social networks and counts and lets you know how many friends you have. And then it has a third number. The third number tells you how many days you have left to live. Based on data that you input into the clock, it basically calculates what your expected life is going to be. How many more days you'll be waking up again. The creators of this clock say that these numbers are important and that they're important to keep track of. Their idea is that if we are reminded about the importance of saving money and accumulating friends, and that our days here on earth are numbered, that we'll approach every day differently, maybe with more intention. This little dose of reality delivered each morning as we wake up is supposed to motivate us to make the most of the day that we're waking up to. Now, we could talk for a while about whether or not these three metrics are the ones that we would consider valid, and whether the number of friends is more or less important than the quality of our relationships. We'd probably all agree that it's good to have some money in the bank, to try to save some money. But the number that I get stuck on is, of course, this last one, this days to live figure. Now, the idea of this alarm clock, or at least that figure, isn't new. I've seen marketed for a while now something they call a countdown clock that you can keep on your desk at work. My reaction to these has always been the same. It's like, how depressing. How depressing to wake up each morning and see that we've got one day less to live than we did the day before. And we know, of course, that is the truth. That's the reality that we live with. But to have it thrown into our face every day, I'm not sure how motivating that would be. And so after I heard this story on the radio about this new alarm clock, you probably can guess what I did. I didn't buy the alarm clock, no. But I went online and I tried to figure out what my number is. And because now you can find anything you want, not just in Alice's restaurant, but on the web, it was pretty easy. There actually is a University of Pennsylvania site, and it's footnoted in the text of my sermon, so if you get the copy, you'll see that. You can do this too. You can go on this UPenn website and answer about 20 questions that they pose, and it tells you what your life expectancy is. So, according to the researchers at the University of Pennsylvania, my number is 9,836. Well, it's actually 9,834 because I did that 2 days ago. Now, when I heard this number, I kind of went, huh. It didn't really have any great significance for me. I noticed it was fewer than 10,000, but it just didn't give me a wake-up call, if you will. Maybe counting it down each day would be different. But I wonder what number you have to get to say to yourself, uh-oh, I better start living every day like I mean it. Is that number 1,000? 500? 100? I'm thinking that maybe a more motivating alarm clock would flash the number 1 every day. Now, this whole idea of this alarm clock got me thinking about our reaction to being forced to face reality, to face facts, if you will. And the radio report about this alarm clock dug into this a little bit. And it looked at how we as human beings respond to being confronted with large doses of reality. And scientists, I'll tell you, have discovered that the answer is not all too well. What they tell us now is that we do better, we cope better with the stresses in our lives when we're able to maintain a balance between reality-based thinking, as they call it, and hopeful or positive thinking, even if the hopeful or positive thinking isn't based in reality. Scientists say that the optimal approach to life is to maintain a positive, confident outlook, even if it's not really connected to reality, but to maintain that positive outlook in our everyday, ordinary living. But when it comes to making significant decisions to become reality-based, they tell us that when we're asked, for example, to make a presentation at work, even if we're not objectively, realistically good at making presentations, it's good to be confident. It's good to be positive. It's good to let go of the reality of what may be there because we'll actually live into that. But if, for instance, you've gotten some kind of diagnosis and you have to figure out your treatment options, they say that's when you need to get down to reality-based thinking. That balancing, I think, is something that we do a lot and we engage in all the time, and it makes sense to me what the scientists are telling us. But then I think about some of our most inspirational, motivational, dynamic, transformational leaders and how they respond to certain realities. And you heard Nelson Mandela's inaugural speech, parts of his inaugural speech, and I thought about how he faced his reality, an undeniable reality. He was born into this system where he was less than human. He started to fight against it, and he was found by the courts to be a traitor and sentenced to life imprisonment. His reality on a day-to-day basis was a 6-foot by 8-foot cell, penned in like an animal, by concrete walls. His reality, day in and day out, year after year, for almost 3 decades, were just these walls, or being able to go outside and sit at a pile of rocks with a hammer. He spent his life where nothing changed for 27 years. He received 1 or perhaps 2 letters a year. During the course of his imprisonment, he had 3 visitors over 27 years. That was his reality. And yet, he emerged from that reality hopeful. And not just hopeful, but determined. And not just determined, but forgiving. And then he goes on to lead his country to a whole new reality. Where does that hope reside in such a hopeless reality? I would also say that we are beginning to witness a similar transformation within the Catholic Church. Pope Francis. Now understand, you don't get to be Pope unless you go along, unless you fit within the system and you rise up within the ranks, which he had to do to get to where he is today. He worked within and is a part of that system. And yet he suddenly introduced these radical concepts, or radical for the church today, into this conservative, reactionary institution. Who am I to judge? Who am I to judge? Those were the words he used when he replied to reporters who asked him whether or not priests who were gay should be able to express themselves as openly gay within the priesthood. Who am I to judge? He said. Well, the answer to that is, you're the Pope. That's your job. At least that's the job of the Pope as we've seen it over the past 1,000 years or so. And here's a man who, with a few simple words, has begun, at least we can hope that he's begun, a radical transformation of the church. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't believe that we are going to see a change on the Catholic Church position on abortion or marriage equality anytime soon. But Pope Francis is refocusing the church. He's changing the conversation and directing the church to things that matter: justice, equality, compassion. There's something going on here that's more than just appearances. It's more than just the fact that he's living in an apartment and not a palace, that he's driving a Ford and not being limoed around, that he's not wearing those red shoes. It's more than just appearances. So where does the hope for transformation of this institution that's been around for 2,000 years come from? Within a man who has worked within and lived within the constraints of that institution for his whole life. The radical hope that Nelson Mandela embodied and that Pope Francis is at least starting to create doesn't deny reality. Mandela's 6 by 8 foot reality was the only thing he knew for nearly 30 years. The reality that Francis faces within the church has been the same for millennia. And yet each has cast a vision of a different reality, a new reality. And herein, I think, is the important lesson. Hope cannot survive without vision. Hope cannot survive without vision. Current conditions can't be overcome without a clear picture of some future desired state. Somehow, I have no idea where it came from, but somehow, within his years of confinement, Nelson Mandela maintained a vision of a free and just South Africa where the wounds of apartheid were reconciled and whites and black citizens would live in peace and equality. How did he do that? But he did it. And somehow, amid all the scandals and the excesses of the church, Pope Francis has held on to the vision of the church that was cast by Jesus 2,000 years ago. Vision is vital. Vision is the harbor in which hope resides. I learned this lesson myself a couple of years ago when I was involved in the Occupy movement in Occupy Philly. I had the privilege of going to a national gathering of clergy out in Berkeley, California. And on the plane ride, I had the good fortune to sit next to someone you may not ever have heard of, but who is a giant when it comes to issues of poverty, equality, and justice. His name is Rabbi Arthur Waskow, and he founded the Shalom Center in Philadelphia. He's more than 80 years old now, and he's dedicated most of those 80 years of his life to causes of nuclear disarmament, peacemaking, and economic equality. It was a privilege to be able to sit and talk with him for those few hours. And so during the flight, I asked him, since I was new to this whole thing, I was down at Occupy trying this out to see if I could do something. And I asked him, how do you sustain hope over the long haul? How do you sustain hope when the odds look so overwhelming? I said, Arthur, what keeps you going? And what he said to me is this. He said, it's all about keeping an eye on where you're going. If you get bogged down in the terrible state of the world, you'd probably give up. But I don't think about that, he said. I keep a picture in my mind of what the world will be like when we win. I keep a picture in my mind of what the world will be like when we win. This notion that vision is the harbor of hope is true for both individuals and institutions alike. And sometimes I think in our churches we tend to lose sight of that. Sometimes it's like that countdown clock. That countdown clock puts reality in front of us, but not vision or hope. And here in our churches sometimes we're quick to point out injustices, but reluctant or maybe sometimes unable to articulate or cast a vision. The reality is that 30,000 Americans are killed by guns every year. The reality is that 22%, or almost 1/4 of American children are living in poverty. The reality is that while people of color make up about 30% of our population, they make up more than 60% of those incarcerated in this country. The reality is that the federal minimum wage for tipped workers is still $2.13 an hour, and it hasn't changed for decades. The reality is that the top 1% of Americans now hold nearly 35% of the wealth in this country. The reality is that nearly 15% of U.S. households, or 1 out of every 7 households in this country, faces issues of hunger. The reality is that 42% of the residents of the city of Chester, 42%, have income levels below the federal poverty line. And of those, 14% of them earn less than half of the federal poverty level. Those are realities. Those are just some of the realities that we face in our nation and in our own backyard. We can and we should be outraged by these realities. And we should do something about them, and we do things about them. We have the Thresholds program, who's working to help prison inmates make better decisions for when they're able to get out. But how do we sustain hope in the face of these daunting realities, in the face of our own perceived limitations, in the face of overwhelming odds? In the words of Arthur Waskow, it's by keeping in our minds a picture of the world, what the world will be like when we win. And I would say it's not just about keeping that picture in our minds, but it's about sharing it with everyone around us and painting the picture together, about holding it up for others to see. The Bible tells us, without vision the people will perish, and I suppose that's true, but before they die, hope will founder, energy will dissipate, and we will succumb to the forces of inertia. It's true on an institutional level, it's true on a personal level too. Each of us faces certain realities. There's only so much time in every day. We make a certain amount in our jobs if we're lucky enough to have one. We are alone or we're in relationships. We have obligations to meet. We can stay stuck and focused on these realities. But if we're interested in changing them, we need a vision for ourselves. And so, as we enter into this new year, I ask you, what is the picture that you have for yourself? What is the vision you have for yourself in this coming year, in 2 years, in 5 years, in 10 years? We all need a vision to help us sustain our hope, to get us past that fad of the New Year's resolution, so that it can become a reality, a new reality in the future. Arthur Waskow pointed out to me, not even Moses made it to the promised land, but he had a vision that sustained his people for all those years in the desert. That new alarm clock tells us how many days we have left to do what needs to be done. That is the reality we face. We are limited in our days. But what it cannot tell us is who or what we want to make of ourselves in those days to come, and what we want to make of our world. It doesn't give us the vision. Now that would be an alarm clock worth waking up to. This day and every day, I wish you peace. Amen.